Hello, everyone. Welcome to Answering the Call. My name is William Hemsworth, and welcome to my little nook on the Elevation Radio Network. I'm honored to have my guest, Thomas Salerno. He's a author, and he's written on Bishop Barron's Word on Fire and on voyagecomics.com. And you can visit his website, thomasjsalernowrites.com, to check out his stuff. And there's also a cool link to his new Substack. So if you want to check out other things that he's doing, Thomas, how are you doing?
William, I'm doing great. It's fantastic to be on your show, and I can't wait to get into the world of writing, especially the kind of writing I do, engaging with faith and popular culture.
Absolutely, and I really enjoy the stuff you do. You write a lot of stuff with the sci-fi and everything else like that, and you weave that into faith, which I think is a very unique way of evangelizing, really, and getting the faith out there. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about yourself, because I know you've been on other shows that I've done. This is kind of a new audience here. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into writing?
Sure. So I'm a Roman Catholic Christian, a cradle Catholic, as we say, meaning like you know, my parents are Catholic, had me baptized, brought me up in the faith, and my faith is something that's really been important to me, like throughout my life. I went to Catholic high school, but I've also been kind of like a nerd from like almost day one. I grew up with, the Batman animated series and Star Wars. And then when I was 13, I read J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, which just knocked my socks off and just changed my life forever. Like I pretty much knew then I wanted to be a writer of some sort. I didn't know I would eventually be kind of doing writing as one of the primary things that I do. I just had this feeling that I wanted to write and sort of use that talent that I knew I had for words to inspire and educate people. I ended up going to college. My major was anthropology because I'm also a science geek. And after college, I worked for a few years actually at the American Museum of Natural History in New York, both in the paleontology and the anthropology department. So I got to work with fossils, which was really cool. Unfortunately, I lost that job during the whole COVID nightmare. And it was actually during that period that I kind of jumped feet first into writing. I had lost my job. I needed something to help pull me through that period. And I had been writing sort of on and off. I had a personal blog, which is now kind of defunct. So I had been doing some writing. But in the period when I was looking for work during COVID, I started sending out pieces first to Voyage Comics, which is a small Catholic-owned comic book company, but they also have a blog all about science fiction,
Right.
fantasy, and superheroes. So I sent some articles out to them, and Philip Kozlowski, the editor there, he gave me my first gig. He published some of my first pieces, and through connections that I made over social media, I was able to connect with people who worked at Bishop Robert Barron's Word on Fire apostolate, and many other Catholic and also just generally Christian websites. And so over the past 2 years, that's primarily what I've been doing. I've been a freelance writer. I've also been on a bunch of podcasts. Recently, I became a member of the StarQuest podcast network, which is a Catholic podcasting conglomerate where they talk about geeky things. You may recognize some of the names from there: Jimmy Akin, Don Bettinelli.
Oh, sure.
But in any case, yeah, I've been a full-time writer for 2 years now. I actually plan in the future to go into more kind of an education route as my full-time job, but I'll still always be writing just because I love doing it. I really have a passion.
Oh, absolutely. Now, you mentioned before that when you had the job at the museum that you were writing on and off.
Yeah.
What were some of the things that you were writing?
At that time, I was trying to kind of connect with my job. So I was writing, and I was doing this in college too. I was doing a lot of science writing.
Okay.
So whenever there was like a new discovery in the fields of paleontology or anthropology, I would try to write about it. it's very difficult to kind of make your mark in science writing, I found, because a lot of the sort of big name science writers or those who, work for, say, National Geographic or
Mhm.
Scientific American, they have access to um, papers and discoveries that are going to come out early. So they have a chance to kind of research and get their pieces out right when the discovery is big news. That wasn't something I could necessarily do, even though I worked at a museum. I just didn't have access. So, I would ended up being frustrated with science writing because by the time I could get access to a technical paper, read it several times to digest its contents,
It's like old
and
news at
then
that point.
yeah, precisely. By the time I got my own thoughts out, it was old news. So I started thinking about just writing essays on some of the other topics I was interested in. I'm a big fan of superheroes and science fiction. So I started doing comic book reviews on my old blog. And, people started being interested in that. And that's what inspired me to start submitting to Voyage Comics and other websites.
Okay. Now I know you write at the intersection of faith and, well, as you say, geek culture. Okay,
Right.
I know you said that term before, and it's on your website as well. What exactly is geek culture for those that aren't familiar?
Well, that's the thing, right? It's kind of hard to define because geek culture is a very broad term and it's actually changed since I was a kid because it's kind of become mainstream
Yeah.
with the success of like Star Wars and the Marvel movies, especially. But I would define it as just an interest in genre fiction, generally, like science fiction, fantasy, comic books, video games, Japanese anime and manga, any of those things that are like not, uh, typically, literary fiction. And they usually involve some fantastical element, whether it's magic or spaceships or superheroes or, and it it's not just for kids these days. We've all grown up kind of saturated in this environment. And so a lot of us as adults maintain our interest in these topics and there's a wide audience for it, which may cause some problems. And we may get into that later because I'm of the strong opinion that there's not enough, especially in the comic book realm these days, that's directed, at kids in general. A lot of it
Mm.
is more geared towards adults now and its content. And it's really important. I harp on this, but it's really important for parents to make informed decisions when buying kind of geeky material for their children.
Oh, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. So you're at the museum, you unfortunately lost your job due to COVID, as so many did at that point, unfortunately. And was writing one of those things that was it out of necessity, or was it something that you just felt pardon the pun, the call to do at that point?
I would say definitely both. It was definitely something I had felt that itch for years. And like I said, it was almost like the Lord was preparing for me because in those months before COVID hit, I had started writing more consistently and posting to my blog more consistently. So it's almost like he was preparing for me, you know, this talent that I could fall back on to help support myself in those months where it turned into years where I didn't really have steady work. So it was definitely out of necessity, but also just out of that. It was almost like losing the job was providential because it really helped me jump feet first into that calling to help share knowledge and my passion in kind of an informal education kind of way with other people. And I've really been sort of growing in that vocation to kind of be an informal educator.
Okay, great. Now, in reading some of your pieces, and I want to get your opinion on this. I mean, I know where you're going to land, but I want the audience to hear it. There's some in Christian circles that kind of look down on the whole sci-fi genre.
Mhm.
What would you say to them?
I would say that there is actually plenty in the sci-fi and fantasy genres that has broad overlap with Christian faith. Let's take sci-fi in particular. The thing I love about science fiction is that it can address really big, meaty questions in a way that's not really threatening or that puts people's hackles up in a way. Science fiction can talk about big questions about life, philosophy, the meaning of the universe, just by taking these topics and putting them in a fantastical setting, whether it's in the future or in deep space. There's actually a great tradition of Christian writers writing in science fiction, and you won't see this really promoted in secular circles. Of course, many Christians know and love C.S. Lewis, and
Sure.
he wrote his space trilogy. It's not as famous as his Narnia books, but he goes into questions of uh, why would God possibly create life on other planets, and what is the implications for that, for salvation and other big questions. And he can explore all these ideas of original sin and free will by setting them on Mars and on Venus and on other planets. There's also a science fiction novel written by a Catholic author, which I actually just finished reading for a new piece that rereading for a new piece that I'm writing. That's called A Canticle for Leibowitz. And it was a very early post-apocalyptic novel written in the 50s by an author named Walter M. Miller. And it is set in the aftermath of a nuclear war in which most literacy and knowledge has been lost, but it's preserved in Catholic monasteries.
Huh.
And this book explores a lot of the relationship between faith and science, between the church and the secular world. It even has some very interesting explorations at the end of the book about original sin and about space exploration and things like that. I just think that science fiction is just a wonderful vehicle to explore the really big questions. It's a shame that a lot of secular science fiction writers today aren't interested in tackling kind of these deep theological questions, but there is a kind of sleeper current throughout the decades of Christian science fiction writers. And I hope partially through my writing to inspire others, to inspire Christians who maybe feel that desire to write and who are also fans of these genres to write in science fiction. We need new stories, especially in our current time, when the discourse is dominated by secular voices.
Right. So, over the course of your writing, what have you heard from your readers in regard to well, tackling these issues and like gets pulling them out of fantasy, science fiction, etc.?
Yeah, I get a lot of feedback from readers who, who are both Christian and who have been fans of comic books, fantasy, and sci-fi from a young age, and who contacted me and say, I've always been a fan of this stuff, but I never really thought about how it connects to the Catholic faith or the Christian faith in general, and how we can see themes of heroism and self-sacrifice, weaved throughout these stories. I just get a lot of good feedback from people who have been inspired to look at these stories in new ways and to apply them. Also that a lot of these stories are heavily inspired by scripture, even if some of the secular authors of these stories don't realize it, because scripture has just been the Western culture specifically for the last 2,000 years has been soaked in scripture. And so some of these allusions to scriptural stories, they can't help but coming out in other people's writings. Like I like to reference Superman, who's clearly a Moses type figure, right? Instead of being put in a basket and put in a space capsule and sent to another planet, the creators of Superman were both young Jews from Cleveland, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, and they incorporated scriptural themes into Superman's story, even Christian themes that they were interested in, even though they themselves were not Christian. So I get a lot of feedback from people who either thank me for revealing these things that they didn't know about, or who are just just happy to see their interests in these kind of topics explored through a Christian lens.
What would be the evangelism implications of maybe doing more of this science fiction writing, this fantasy writing? What would be the implications of that?
Oh yeah, I love talking about this topic because I wrote an essay for Word on Fire a few months ago, after the most recent Spider-Man movie came out. And I called it Baptizing the New Mythology. And the reason why I called it that is because the church fathers, in the very early centuries of the church, looked at the mythologies of the pagan societies that surrounded them, particularly the dominant in the West Greco-Roman, monoculture. And they looked at these mythological stories and said, okay, we can't take any of these stories as literal. They're all about pagan gods and demigods and heroes and such. But there are good lessons to be taken from these stories. The fathers called it the seeds of the word, or the seeds of the gospel, that you could find in these stories that were popular in the broader pagan and secular culture of the time, echoes of what eventually would be God's fulfillment of revelation in the gospel. And so they kind of baptized the old pagan myths and used them to instruct Christians on how to grow in virtue. I went to a Catholic high school that was very interested in getting its students to read classical mythology. Now, I fell in love with the Greek and Roman and Norse myths by attending a Catholic school, and they were pointing out to us, like, okay, these stories grew up out of a pagan culture, but you can see where, they put a big stress on heroism and virtue and self-sacrifice, which are ideas that we as Christians can identify with. And I think the same thing can be done with what I call the modern mythology, and that's sci-fi fantasy, and especially comic books. Comic book superheroes are basically the new sort of mythological figures. They're like the gods and demigods of Greece and Rome. And like those stories, they're immensely popular, thanks to, big Hollywood cinema. So those stories are in their moment right now. And I think it's wrong to just dismiss them. It's wrong to just say, oh, that doesn't have anything to do with what we believe, And I think if you take that route of just dismissing these stories, you're missing a huge opportunity for evangelism. When I saw Spider-Man No Way Home, that theater was packed with young people. And that movie had a lot of great themes about self-sacrifice and loving one's enemies, which I just found, I'm like, these kids are being primed with messages that we as Christians take for granted. And we need to show these kids, look, these themes in your popular entertainment were there before comic books. That these themes grow out of the Judeo-Christian tradition.
Sure.
And I think that if we can show this to young people, we can get them interested in exploring that tradition much more deeply.
So, Thomas, with the time we have left, what do you see is in the future for you as far as your writing goes? And I guess you also talk about education and all that. We can get into that a little bit too. But as far as your writing ministry, where do you see that going?
Actually, right now, I am working on putting a book together, which
Awesome.
will be a collection of a lot of my best essays from both Word on Fire and Voyage Comics. About 2/3 of the book are going to be previously published material. And then the remaining third of the book is going to be new material, new essays exclusive to the book. So even if you've read all my essays online before, there's going to be something new for you here. And I'm actually calling it Baptizing the New Mythology.
Okay.
That's the title I'm going with. I'm hoping to self-publish the book on Kindle and hopefully get a physical version either by the end of this year or by the very latest in February, which is when my birthday rolls around.
All right.
So yeah, I'm definitely pushing hard on that book this year. I've already edited and revised all the previously published material. So right now I'm working on the new stuff. So stay tuned for that. Also, yeah, I'm very interested in doing education in a more traditional context. I'm definitely looking into opportunities to either like do public history in a way, because I'm also a big history buff, or to actually, I'm looking into ways that I could perhaps get certified as a teacher. So I really think that my writing has been an expression of what I kind of think my primary vocation is, which is education. And I just want to go all in on that in the future.
As a teacher myself, really happy to hear that, because we need more strong Christian role models for the kids out there. So that's awesome. I'm glad to hear that. Thomas, where can our listeners check out your stuff? And you mentioned you mentioned the podcast network. Can you talk about that a little bit? I'm sorry, I almost skipped over that.
Yeah, so the StarQuest podcast network, I believe their website is sqpn.com. It's sqpn.com. If you're Christian and you like science fiction, fantasy, and comic books, they are the place to go. They have podcasts about Star Wars, Star Trek, Doctor Who. I'm going to be on an upcoming podcast with them. I'll be a regular guest, but we're going to be talking about the new Lord of the Rings on Amazon Prime
Okay.
television show. And I'm also a regular guest on their Secrets of Movies and TV podcast. We've already talked about the Blade Runner series. We did Close Encounters of the Third Kind. So it's been great. You can find me and a lot of great Christian podcasters on that network. And yeah, also if listeners go to my website, thomasjsalernowrites.com, which is currently in the process of revamping. You can actually find a link there. There's a button that you can click that takes you directly to my new Substack, where I will be posting updates about my new book and exclusive essays. So stay tuned for that, guys.
Great. Thomas, thank you so much for your time today. Thanks for what you do in your ministry, and always great talking with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, William. It's been a blast.
All right. God bless you.
God bless.